Could Prince William's life as we know it be over? Doctors have confirmed what many feared in whispers and quiet speculation. The headlines are terrifying, the rumors relentless, and the truth. Well, the truth is far darker than anyone could have imagined. From the outside, he is the epitome of royal strength. Confident, poised, seemingly untouchable. But behind closed doors, the picture is far more fragile. And today, we're pulling back the velvet curtain to reveal what the palace has worked so hard to keep hidden. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began subtly. A handshake that lingered a beat too long. A tilt of the head, a fleeting grimace at an official engagement. Small things that most people would never notice, but the keen eye of royal aides and longtime palace staff caught them immediately. You might ask, is this really a story about illness, or is it a tale of perception versus reality? The answer is both, and as we'll uncover, these small signals were just the surface of a far more urgent crisis. The first reports of concern came from those closest to him, Kate, his confidants, and the doctors entrusted with his health. They noticed something that couldn't be explained away by the usual pressures of public life. And while the palace has always been a fortress of secrecy, insiders began leaking information carefully, cautiously. You have to ask yourself, why now? Why leak these details at this precise moment? The answer lies in a mix of fear, frustration, and perhaps the inevitability that truth has a way of breaking through even the thickest walls. We don't yet know all the details, but what we do know paints a picture that is both shocking and heartbreaking. Prince William, heir to one of the most storied monarchies in the world, is facing a battle that is intensely personal and deeply public at the same time. Imagine living under constant scrutiny while grappling with a diagnosis that could alter every aspect of your life. Could you handle that kind of pressure? Could you continue to smile for cameras, attend ceremonial events, and uphold the image of perfection while your body, or your mind, was betraying you? Royal life has always been about control. Controlling perception, controlling appearances, controlling narratives. But what happens when the very thing you strive to control, your health, your strength, your future, slips out of your grasp? The palace, as we know it, has rules, procedures, and protocols for every imaginable scenario. Yet even with all their preparation, this is the kind of news that doesn't fit neatly into a briefing or a statement. It's raw, unpredictable, and devastating. And for William, it's profoundly personal. Sources close to the royal family describe recent weeks as tense, filled with hushed conversations and urgent meetings behind closed doors. One aide reportedly said, "The atmosphere has changed. There's a weight now that wasn't there before." Can you imagine that? A palace usually filled with pomp and ceremony suddenly overshadowed by fear and uncertainty. Even Prince Charles, who has weathered decades of public scrutiny, is reportedly shaken. It's not just about health. It's about legacy, responsibility, and the heavy burden of an institution built over centuries. The public's perception of William is of unwavering strength, a man who embodies duty, integrity, and stoicism. But strength in public does not always translate to private resilience. In fact, often it is the very image of strength that masks vulnerability. Imagine the pressure. Cameras flashing, every gesture analyzed, the expectation to appear unflinching, all while confronting a diagnosis that could change everything. The emotional toll is immense, and those closest to him are bearing witness. How do you maintain composure when everything you've been trained to uphold feels suddenly precarious? The emotional complexity is staggering. Kate, reportedly his anchor through countless challenges, has had to navigate not only her own fears but the immense responsibility of supporting someone who must remain a symbol of stability. There have been late-night conversations, quiet reassurances, and moments of shared anxiety that have never been witnessed by the public eye. It's a reminder that even the most public of figures live private lives fraught with struggle, heartache, and doubt. And yet, despite the gravity of the situation, life goes on in the public eye. Official engagements, ceremonial duties, and appearances continue, giving the world a glimpse of normalcy that masks the chaos behind the palace doors. There's a stark contrast between perception and reality. How many people realize the tension behind a perfectly executed smile or a confident wave? The answer is few. The truth is hidden in the quiet moments, in the fleeting expressions that the cameras miss, in the silence between the ceremonial speeches. Whispers of concern began circulating among palace staff months ago, but the public remained largely unaware. Insiders note that early warning signs were subtle: minor lapses in focus, fleeting discomfort during public events, changes in posture. At first, they were dismissed as exhaustion or the result of demanding schedules. But as weeks passed, the patterns became impossible to ignore. Doctors reportedly recommended further tests, increased monitoring, and even reconsideration of his duties. Each recommendation, each new observation, added layers of worry that were carefully contained from the public eye. And then, the unthinkable happened: a series of tests that confirmed what everyone feared but no one dared to say out loud. The palace's response has been meticulous. They have always been experts at controlling information, managing narratives, and projecting a flawless image to the public. Yet, this is a story that resists control. Despite their best efforts, fragments of information began to leak. Rumors of medical consultations, quiet departures from engagements, a hint of fatigue in moments previously marked by unwavering composure. It's a stark reminder that even the most carefully curated lives are not immune to reality, and even the most disciplined institutions cannot fully contain truth. At this point, the audience must ask themselves, what exactly did the doctors find? How severe is the situation? And most importantly, what does this mean for the monarchy, the public, and the family closest to William? These questions are not rhetorical. They are urgent, immediate, and deeply personal. The unfolding story is about more than headlines or speculation. It is about a human being, a family, and an institution all facing the pressure of an unprecedented challenge. Even as the rumors grew, the palace maintained a carefully orchestrated calm. Press releases were vague, engagements proceeded as scheduled, and public appearances were flawlessly executed. But insiders hint at a tension that cannot be masked. Staff whisper about urgent meetings, sudden cancellations, and a palpable anxiety that hangs over the corridors of the royal residences. There is a sense of inevitability, a growing understanding that the narrative will no longer be contained. And when it breaks, the impact will be immense. And now, as we prepare to explore the full story, it's important to acknowledge the stakes. Prince William is not just a public figure. He is an emblem of stability, tradition, and continuity for the monarchy. The implications of this diagnosis ripple far beyond his personal life. They touch the line of succession, the perception of the monarchy, and the emotional well-being of an entire nation. This is a story of vulnerability, courage, and the fragile balance between public duty and private reality. But what makes this story truly heartbreaking and truly shocking is not just the diagnosis itself. It's the unfolding tension between image and truth, perception and reality, hope and despair. As the palace navigates this crisis, and as William confronts this deeply personal challenge, every decision, every revelation, and every hidden truth could alter the course of history. And it's in this delicate balance that we find the drama, the suspense, and the emotional weight that makes this story impossible to ignore. So what comes next? How did the latest test results change everything we thought we knew? And more importantly, how is the royal family coping with a reality that they cannot control? In the chapters ahead, we will peel back the layers, reveal the shocking details, and explore the deeply human side of this story. From the first subtle warning signs to the latest developments that left even insiders stunned, this is a narrative that blends drama, emotion, and high stakes in a way that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with the smallest things, gestures so subtle that most people would have dismissed them as nothing. A wince when adjusting his posture, a hand lingering a fraction too long on a railing, a flicker of hesitation when moving from one room to another. Yet for those closest to him, these were signals that could not be ignored. The palace, a place where image is everything, had suddenly become a place where vulnerability whispered loudly in the corners. And for Prince William, the first warning signs were beginning to reveal a hidden battle that no one was prepared for. You might wonder, how do you spot these things in a man who has been trained his entire life to appear flawless, composed, and untouchable? The answer lies in the observation of those who have served him for years, who know the cadence of his movements, the rhythm of his expressions, and the subtle language of body and mind. A slight tremor, an unexpected pause in conversation, a shadow crossing his usually steady gaze. These are the silent alarms that first set the palace staff on edge. And the truth is, once they noticed, there was no turning back. The first signs emerged during public engagements that seemed routine. At a charity gala, William greeted dignitaries with the usual warmth, the usual precision. But in a fleeting moment, as the cameras caught a brief shift in his posture, those who watched closely noticed something off. A subtle slump, almost imperceptible, but enough to trigger an internal alarm. One palisade would later say, "I thought I was imagining it at first, but then I saw it again and again. Something was not right, and it was only going to get worse if we ignored it." And yet, the public saw nothing. The press photographs showed the same composed air, smiling, shaking hands, delivering speeches with effortless charisma. This is a critical element of the story, the contrast between perception and reality. To the world, Prince William remained a symbol of strength and stability. But behind the scenes, the first warning signs were creating ripples of concern that would soon grow into tidal waves. The most telling moments, insiders reveal, happened in private, during brief intervals when the cameras were off, and the world's gaze was temporarily diverted. A hurried meeting in a quiet corridor, a pause before speaking at a closed-door briefing, a fleeting look of fatigue that lingered longer than it should have. These small moments, captured only by those closest to him, revealed that something was amiss, and it was more than mere exhaustion or the pressures of royal duty. Kate, ever vigilant and fiercely protective, was among the first to notice. In whispered conversations with aides, she reportedly expressed concern about the subtle changes she was seeing. "He's not himself," she is said to have said, her voice tinged with worry. "I can feel it. Something is happening beneath the surface." The weight of that concern cannot be understated. Kate's instinctive attention to detail, her empathy, and her deep understanding of William's usual demeanor made her observations both credible and alarming. When someone so attuned to his behavior signals worry, it becomes impossible to ignore. Observers began to piece together the early signs, connecting isolated incidents into a pattern too disturbing to overlook. There was a visit to a hospital foundation where William, usually animated and engaged, appeared distracted, his focus wavering. At a children's charity event, he briefly struggled to maintain balance while bending down to speak with a young patient. Each occurrence on its own could be written off. Taken together, they painted a narrative that hinted at a problem far deeper than casual fatigue. Palace staff, ever loyal and discreet, found themselves in a delicate position. How do you address a potential health issue in a man who is both your employer and the symbol of an institution? They began documenting each incident, compiling notes, and discreetly consulting medical professionals. Every subtle gesture was recorded, every fleeting expression analyzed. These were not idle observations. They were the first pieces of a puzzle that would eventually reveal a much larger, more tragic picture. But there was more than just the physical signs. Insiders noted a shift in demeanor, a change in the cadence of his speech during private meetings. Words that once flowed smoothly now required pauses, moments of hesitation that were uncharacteristic for a man trained to lead, speak, and command attention. The human mind, under duress, often betrays itself in subtle ways before the body does. And those closest to William noticed these mental cues, understanding that they could precede far more serious developments. It wasn't just aides and family who noticed. Longtime photographers, whose work has followed the royal family for decades, began capturing images that told a story behind the public smile. A tilted head, a fleeting grimace, an almost imperceptible handshake, all caught on camera, later analyzed frame by experts. The public, unaware, saw only a prince fulfilling his duties. But for those trained to read the signs of stress, strain, or illness, these images were deeply concerning. And then came the first whispers of medical intervention. While the public had no knowledge, palace insiders began to discuss discreet health assessments, subtle check-ins with doctors, and monitoring of William's routine. Some recommended minor tests, others suggested more invasive screenings. Each suggestion sparked debate. How much should the family intervene? How much should remain private? The answer would become increasingly urgent as the subtle signs began to escalate. Friends outside the palace circle also noticed changes. Those who interacted with William in informal settings reported unusual fatigue, moments of hesitation, and expressions of concern that he rarely shared. One close friend reportedly said, "He seemed tired in a way that wasn't just physical. There was a weight on him, an invisible pressure that made it hard to be his usual self." Such observations reinforced the emerging narrative. The warning signs were real, consistent, and deeply concerning. The irony of the situation was not lost on palace staff. Here was a man trained to project unwavering composure, whose every gesture is scrutinized and whose image is carefully managed, yet the first signs of vulnerability were becoming impossible to conceal. The contrast between public perception and private reality intensified the concern. How does a palace maintain control when the person at the center of it all shows the first cracks in a carefully constructed image of invincibility? As these warning signs continued, tension mounted behind the palace walls. Meetings became more frequent, aides whispered in corridors, and the medical team began compiling observations and test results. What began as subtle gestures evolved into patterns that could no longer be ignored. A series of private consultations was arranged, leading to more tests, more assessments, and ultimately, a grim realization. These early signs were not trivial. They were the beginning of a serious health crisis. Yet, the public remained blissfully unaware. To them, Prince William continued to fulfill his duties with the same precision, poise, and commitment as ever. The contrast between the carefully curated public image and the unfolding private reality created a tension that was almost cinematic. It was a story of hidden struggle, one that only insiders could fully grasp. And it was only the beginning. The critical question now became, what did these early signs signify? Could they be managed, or were they the first harbinger of something far more serious? Insiders feared the latter. And as the first round of medical evaluations concluded, a chilling realization began to take shape. What the palace had hoped was minor might, in fact, be deeply significant. And just when the staff thought they had a handle on the situation, a small but alarming development occurred. During a routine event, William experienced a brief moment that he could not hide, a flash of discomfort, a subtle grimace, captured by the cameras. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but those who knew him best recognized it immediately. It confirmed what they had been fearing for weeks. The warning signs were not only real, they were escalating. And so the first chapter of this unfolding drama ends not with answers, but with questions. What exactly is happening? How serious is the condition? And, perhaps most importantly, how long can these warning signs continue before the situation becomes impossible to contain? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Not everyone in the palace was willing to speak, even behind closed doors. But when the whispers grew louder and the warning signs of Prince William's condition could no longer be ignored, the royal doctors stepped in. And what they revealed, though carefully framed in discretion, was chilling. It was the kind of news that made even the most seasoned aides pause, the kind of information that forced an institution built on appearances to confront a reality it had long avoided. Imagine this. A man trained to maintain composure under every circumstance, whose life has been dissected and scrutinized by millions, suddenly forced to confront a health issue that could affect everything: the monarchy, his family, and himself. That is the magnitude of what the doctors quietly communicated. At first, their assessments were guarded, clinical. They observed, monitored, and recorded every subtle symptom. But as days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged that left them no choice but to speak, if only to those with clearance, if only to the family and close aides. The initial consultations were described by insiders as tense and meticulous. Every test, every scan, every analysis was reviewed multiple times. Doctors cross-referenced results, debated possibilities, and consulted specialists in fields rarely involved with royal patients. This was not routine monitoring. It was a full-scale medical investigation. And while the palace outwardly projected calm, inside the medical team was preparing for outcomes that were far from reassuring. One source, who spoke under the condition of anonymity, revealed, "The doctors were cautious, but there was no sugarcoating it. The initial assessments were concerning enough that they had to consider worst-case scenarios. The level of scrutiny they applied was unprecedented. Can you imagine the pressure in that room? A team of top professionals, faced with the health of a man who carries centuries of expectation on his shoulders, and tasked with delivering news that could shatter lives if it became public. What makes this chapter of William's story so compelling and so tragic is the combination of secrecy and inevitability. Even before any official statement, insiders began piecing together hints of what the doctors had discovered. Meetings were scheduled at odd hours, aides were pulled aside for private discussions, and subtle shifts in William's schedule were noted. Those who were close enough to observe these changes realized that the medical concern was serious. And yet, to the public, nothing had changed. He still smiled for photographs, still delivered speeches, still attended ceremonies with flawless precision. The doctor's observations were precise, almost surgical in their detail. They didn't just record symptoms, they interpreted them, considered trajectories, and debated potential interventions. And in doing so, they uncovered patterns that were not immediately visible, even to those who had known William for decades. Imagine the complexity of analyzing a body under the constant scrutiny of public expectation while balancing the need for privacy, confidentiality, and accuracy. It's a level of tension almost impossible to convey, yet one that became part of William's daily reality. Experts outside the palace later confirmed that early intervention is critical in situations like these. One consultant specializing in high-profile patients explained, when a person's health is under this level of stress, early detection of subtle changes is essential. But when those signs are hidden by public appearances, the window for intervention can be dangerously narrow. This is exactly what the royal doctors were grappling with, a ticking clock concealed behind a perfect public image. Every day that passed without acknowledgement or treatment increased both the medical risk and the emotional strain. Even within the palace, the doctors faced a difficult balancing act. They had to be candid with the family while remaining discreet. They had to prepare for potential outcomes, some devastating, without inducing panic. And they had to consider not just William's health, but the ripple effects. How would this news affect Prince Charles, Kate, Prince Harry, and the broader institution of the monarchy? Every conversation, every recommendation carried weight beyond the purely medical. Insiders describe moments when doctors would lean close to Kate, whispering updates that she could barely absorb without visible strain. Her concern was immediate, visceral, and deeply human. She reportedly asked questions no one expected. What does this mean for his daily life? For the children? For our family? The doctors, trained to maintain professional composure, found themselves navigating not just a medical scenario, but an emotional one. And that emotional layer would become one of the most compelling elements of this unfolding story. Public perception, of course, remained untouched. William continued to attend official events with a confidence and poise that belied the growing concern behind palace walls. Every handshake, every bow, every speech was carefully executed. To the casual observer, it was business as usual. Yet the tension was palpable to those who knew him well. A simple photograph, one taken in passing, could reveal more than a full statement ever could. And the doctors, in their meticulous monitoring, were always aware of how each moment of public exposure could interact with his physical condition. Perhaps most concerning were the initial tests and imaging results. The specifics remain confidential, but insiders indicate that while nothing was immediately life-threatening, the results suggested a trajectory that required urgent attention. This was not a matter of minor lifestyle adjustments or routine checkups. The findings demanded careful planning, proactive measures, and constant observation. It was a scenario that no amount of public composure could mitigate. And then came the difficult conversations, the ones that even seasoned palace staff dread. Doctors had to convey the gravity of the situation without creating unnecessary fear. They had to outline potential interventions while leaving space for hope. They had to anticipate every question, every concern, every possible reaction from a man unaccustomed to vulnerability. It's an emotional balancing act that few outside the medical field can truly appreciate. One doctor reportedly confided to a close colleague, "We knew the family would respond with a mixture of shock and composure, but we also knew that the gravity of what we had found couldn't be sugar-coated." William is a strong man, but strength doesn't make you invincible. That statement alone hints at the complexity of what the royal household faced, managing not just a medical situation, but a human being, one whose life is inseparable from symbolism, duty, and expectation. The public remained blissfully unaware, but the palace dynamics were shifting. Meetings increased in frequency. Discussions about future engagements, potential medical leave, and contingency plans became routine. The doctor's assessments were thorough, including recommendations that could affect not only William's health, but the public image of the monarchy itself. And yet, despite all of this, the prince continued to perform his duties with seemingly unshakable precision, hiding the storm behind a practiced smile. Even for those within the palace, the tension was palpable. Aides spoke in hushed tones, staff moved with quiet urgency, and the doctors operated under a veil of discretion that allowed them to act without public scrutiny. This duality, public calm, private turmoil, would become a defining theme of the story that unfolded over the following months. It's important to pause and reflect on the stakes. This was not a minor health scare or a routine update. The doctors were observing signs that suggested a trajectory with serious implications. And while William continued to perform his royal duties with the skill and composure the public expects, the reality behind the scenes could not be ignored. Every symptom, every subtle change, and every consultation was a reminder that even the strongest of us are vulnerable. So what exactly did the doctors uncover in those initial consultations? How severe were the signs they observed, and what did they recommend? The details are complex, carefully monitored, and intensely private. Yet insiders hint at results that are deeply concerning, results that would soon set the stage for the next phase of this unfolding drama. And just when it seemed that the palace had contained the situation, a new piece of information surfaced, a detail that even the doctors hadn't anticipated. It suggested a development that could escalate the crisis beyond what anyone had imagined. What came next would shock the palace, surprise the family, and leave insiders scrambling for answers. The news had already been difficult to process. The subtle warning signs, the discreet concerns of aides, the hushed consultations of royal doctors, all of it painted a picture that was unsettling enough. But what came next was something far more serious, something that no one inside the palace fully anticipated. The initial assessments had hinted at a problem. The latest test results confirmed it, and the implications were far graver than anyone could have imagined. Imagine being Prince William for a moment. A life meticulously scripted, every move under public scrutiny, every gesture analyzed for meaning, and suddenly, the script no longer fits. The doctor's findings were stark. The condition was progressing, faster than previously predicted, and the subtle symptoms that had first caught the attention of aides were now part of a larger, undeniable pattern. The tests revealed a worsening that required immediate attention, careful management, and constant vigilance. The private briefings for the family were intense. Kate, who had already been grappling with concern, reportedly found herself overwhelmed by the gravity of the diagnosis. She asked questions that no one wanted to answer aloud. What would this mean for their children? Could William continue to fulfill his royal duties? How long could they manage this situation before it became public? Each answer came with caution, each response layered with both hope and an acknowledgement of the harsh reality. Doctors described the progression in clinical terms, but the emotional weight was impossible to ignore. One insider recounted the moment when a senior royal physician quietly explained the results to William and Kate. It was a room of hushed tones, the aide said. No one spoke loudly, but the tension was palpable. You could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. Even for a man trained to carry immense pressure, the diagnosis hit with a severity that demanded attention and action. The worsening of William's condition was not sudden, but insidious. It began in small ways, a stiffness in movement, a subtle fatigue during long engagements, brief lapses in focus that were previously uncharacteristic. But each incremental change was now a piece of a larger puzzle that the doctors could no longer ignore. They warned that without intervention, the trajectory could compromise not just his physical health, but his capacity to carry out the responsibilities expected of him as heir to the throne. This progression also heightened the tension within the palace. Staff who had previously operated with confidence now walked on eggshells. balancing the need for discretion with the undeniable reality that something significant was unfolding. Meetings increased, schedules shifted, and discussions of contingency plans, once theoretical, became urgent and practical. The reality was inescapable. This was no longer a situation that could be contained behind closed doors. Observers outside the palace began to notice subtle changes as well. At recent public appearances, William appeared more restrained, movements measured with caution, smiles that seemed slightly forced. To the casual viewer, it could be written off as fatigue or the pressures of public life. But insiders knew better. Every gesture, every nuance, was now a signal, a coded language that spoke to the progression of his condition. Doctors recommended new measures, more comprehensive testing, specialized treatment plans, and close monitoring. Each recommendation carried weight beyond the medical. It had implications for public engagements, official appearances, and the perception of stability that the royal family strives to maintain. A delicate balance had to be struck, protecting William's health while preserving the image of strength and continuity. Kate's role became even more critical during this period. Not only was she supporting her husband emotionally, but she also had to act as a buffer between the private reality and the public persona. Insiders describe late-night conversations where she encouraged him, asked the difficult questions, and ensured that he followed medical advice while managing the relentless demands of royal life. Her presence was both grounding and vital, a reminder that even in the most public of lives, private support can be the difference between despair and resilience. As the progression became undeniable, rumors began to circulate. Even the most controlled palace communications could not fully contain speculation. While nothing was officially confirmed to the public, observers noted shifts in engagements, subtle alterations in routine, and changes in William's behavior during official duties. The juxtaposition between public perception and private reality became increasingly stark, fueling intrigue, concern, and a sense of urgency. Medical experts outside the palace, who were later consulted by journalists, described the situation as serious. They emphasized that progressive conditions, if not managed proactively, could escalate quickly, impacting both daily life and long-term outcomes. For someone in William's position, the stakes were exponentially higher. Not only did he have personal health to consider, but the weight of centuries of royal expectation rested on his shoulders. The intersection of vulnerability and responsibility created a tension few could comprehend fully. Even within the palace, the realization that William's condition had worsened caused a ripple effect. Staff members who had been confident in their ability to maintain normalcy now had to operate under heightened scrutiny. Every movement, every schedule adjustment, every public appearance became part of a careful calculus aimed at preserving both health and perception. The balance was precarious, and the margin for error slim. And then there were the moments when William himself confronted the reality. Reports from insiders suggest that he experienced flashes of frustration, moments of vulnerability, and a rare acknowledgement of fear. A man accustomed to control now faced circumstances he could not dictate, a trajectory he could not halt, and a visibility he could not escape. It was a human moment, raw and unfiltered, and one that underscored the profound seriousness of his situation. Medical professionals continued to weigh options. Treatments were discussed, plans drafted, and risk factors evaluated. The challenge was to address the worsening progression without compromising the public duties and image that define a royal heir. Each recommendation had layers of implication, touching on personal health, family stability, and the institution itself. The complexity of the situation created a pressure cooker atmosphere within the palace, a tension that insiders describe as both palpable and unprecedented. But the most shocking part was yet to be revealed. Tests that had initially seemed routine began showing anomalies, subtle but significant shifts that hinted at a deeper complication. While the details are tightly guarded, sources indicate that these findings accelerated concern among the medical team. A sense of urgency permeated the palace, a quiet understanding that the progression of William's condition required immediate and sustained attention. Public appearances continued, yet each one was now a careful choreography. Smiles were measured, movements deliberate, and engagements meticulously planned. Every detail was calculated to mask the progression while ensuring that William's duties continued uninterrupted. The irony was stark. A man whose life is under constant scrutiny had to hide not just his vulnerability, but the very fact that he was at risk, performing a delicate balancing act that few could imagine. Family dynamics, too, began to shift. Prince Charles, previously composed and measured, reportedly showed unusual concern, consulting with medical professionals, aides, and even international experts. Kate remained the stabilizing presence, guiding William through appointments, ensuring adherence to treatment plans, and managing the emotional strain of secrecy. Prince Harry, though physically distant, was reportedly kept informed through discreet channels, his concern palpable despite the miles separating him from the unfolding situation. As the days progressed, the progression of the condition became impossible to ignore. What had started as subtle, almost imperceptible warning signs had now escalated into something undeniable. The palace, staff, and medical team all faced a new reality. The situation had worsened beyond initial expectations. And while the public remained unaware, the private world surrounding William was consumed with urgency, concern, and careful calculation. So, what does this worsening mean for William, his family, and the monarchy? Could interventions slow the progression? Could he continue to perform his duties without compromise? These questions, fraught with uncertainty and fear, now dominated every conversation behind the palace doors. And as insiders began to discuss contingency plans, it became clear that even the most controlled institution was facing a challenge it could not fully predict or manage. And just when the palace thought it had a handle on the situation, a new, alarming development emerged, one that even the doctors had not anticipated. A subtle change in test results suggested a complication that could accelerate the progression, creating consequences far beyond what had been previously considered. What came next would shock the family, unsettle the palace staff, and leave insiders scrambling for solutions they had never imagined. Behind the ornate doors of the palace, life continued as if nothing had changed. Chandeliers sparkled, polished floors reflected the footsteps of staff moving efficiently from room to room, and the daily rhythm of ceremonial life went on. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet storm was brewing, a storm of whispers, secrets, and tension that threatened to crack even the most disciplined walls of the monarchy. For Prince William, the worsening of his diagnosis was no longer just a private concern. It had become a quiet, simmering crisis that affected everyone around him. The first whispers began in hushed tones among the palace aides. They spoke not in public spaces, but in secluded corners, in brief pauses between formal duties, and during the rare moments when the cameras were turned away. "Have you noticed anything?" one would ask, voice barely above a murmur. Another would respond with a nod, careful not to draw attention. These exchanges, seemingly innocuous, were actually the first signals of a growing awareness. Something was very wrong, and no one outside the inner circle could know. Palace staff operate under a code of loyalty that is both rigorous and unwavering. Discretion is paramount, even when the stakes are high. Yet the subtle changes in William's condition could not be contained entirely. A slight limp, a fleeting grimace, or a momentary pause at a public engagement sent ripples of concern through those who were closest to him. And with every ripple, the whispers grew louder, harder to suppress. Staff knew that if these signs were ignored, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for William's health, but for the perception of stability that the palace relied upon. The tension was amplified by the nature of royal life itself. Every action is observed, every gesture interpreted, and every image analyzed. A single misstep could ignite speculation, leading to headlines that the palace would struggle to control. This constant scrutiny added another layer of pressure to an already delicate situation. Even those tasked with supporting William had to balance their duty of care with the imperative of secrecy. It was a dance of precision, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. Within this high-pressure environment, certain insiders began piecing together a narrative that extended beyond the subtle physical signs. They noted patterns in William's schedule, sudden changes, brief absences from meetings, and private consultations that had never occurred before. To those outside the palace, it seemed routine. To insiders, it was a coded message, an indicator that the situation was escalating. Staff began to prepare for scenarios they had never anticipated, quietly coordinating with medical professionals to ensure that every contingency was accounted for. Even within the royal family, whispers carried weight. Kate, deeply attuned to William's needs, reportedly noticed changes before anyone else. She asked questions of aides and doctors alike, probing for details while maintaining composure in public. Her role became both protective and strategic, serving as a bridge between William's private reality and the expectations of public life. Insiders describe her as a stabilizing presence, someone who could interpret the subtle language of his condition and respond in ways that were both practical and deeply compassionate. Meanwhile, Prince Charles and other senior members of the royal household were quietly assessing the situation from a strategic perspective. The implications of William's worsening diagnosis were immense. Succession, public perception, and the continuity of ceremonial duties all hung in the balance. Meetings that once focused on protocol now included discussions about health, contingency plans, and the delicate choreography required to maintain appearances while addressing a serious medical issue. The weight of centuries of tradition pressed down on every decision, creating an atmosphere of controlled urgency that few outside the palace could comprehend. Adding to the complexity was the human element. Staff who had been loyal for decades were suddenly faced with dilemmas they had never imagined. How do you act when the person you serve is vulnerable, when secrecy is paramount, and when the smallest misstep could create a crisis of perception? Many described sleepless nights, quiet conversations filled with uncertainty, and a pervasive sense that the palace itself was navigating uncharted territory. The usual rhythm of life, ceremonial, precise, predictable, was now punctuated by moments of tension that hinted at deeper concerns. Whispers also extended to the medical team. Doctors and aides communicated in code, ensuring that every note, every recommendation, and every observation remained confidential. Yet even in this controlled environment, uncertainty loomed. The progression of William's condition meant that new symptoms could emerge at any moment, requiring immediate action and recalibration of plans. The palace had to be prepared for multiple outcomes simultaneously, maintaining the public image, addressing the medical needs, and managing the emotional dynamics within the family. One aide revealed, under anonymity, that there were moments when the tension was almost palpable. You could feel it in the air, they said. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. Every step, every decision was weighed carefully, because we knew that anything visible to the public could have consequences far beyond what anyone imagined. The gravity of this statement underscores the extraordinary pressure within the palace walls, a pressure that extended to every individual who had a role in maintaining both secrecy and composure. The whispers began to crystallize into actionable concerns. Aides and staff started to notice a rhythm in the private consultations with medical professionals. Appointments were staggered, information carefully filtered, and each observation documented meticulously. The palace became a controlled environment, a delicate ecosystem where every element had to function in harmony to prevent panic or exposure. And yet, despite the discipline, the anxiety was unavoidable. The worsening of William's condition introduced a tension that was both invisible and omnipresent, affecting every decision, every movement, and every interaction. Even within this controlled environment, contradictions emerged. William was simultaneously performing at a high level in public, attending engagements with poise, and maintaining the image of stability, while privately grappling with an increasingly serious diagnosis. The juxtaposition created emotional tension for those closest to him. Observers noted moments of frustration, exhaustion, and vulnerability that, though fleeting, revealed the human cost of maintaining such an image under duress. Insiders also report that the palace became a hive of discrete activity. Plans for emergency responses, potential adjustments to public schedules, and private briefings with family members all intensified. Doctors provided continuous updates. Aides monitored every change in demeanor, and Kate maintained a vigilant presence, bridging the gap between professional advice and emotional support. It was a coordinated effort, one that underscored the gravity of the situation and the unique challenges of balancing public duty with private health. Rumors, of course, began to circulate outside the palace. though they remained fragmented and largely speculative. Observers of royal life noticed subtle inconsistencies, cancellations of appearances, shifts in scheduling, and slight changes in behavior. While the public attributed these to routine fatigue or ceremonial adjustments, insiders knew the truth. These were signals of an escalating health concern, carefully managed and concealed. The contrast between perception and reality grew ever sharper, fueling intrigue and concern for those paying close attention. And yet, despite all the careful management, one moment disrupted the equilibrium entirely. During a recent private meeting with senior aides and medical professionals, an unexpected test result arrived, one that hinted at a complication nobody had anticipated. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Whispered conversations grew tense, staff exchanged worried glances, and the realization set in that the situation was now more serious than they had previously believed. The palace, for all its traditions, protocols, and control, was facing a human crisis that could not be neatly contained. William's worsening condition had moved from subtle warning signs to an undeniable reality, and the whispers among staff were now tinged with urgency, concern, and fear. What had begun as discreet observations had become a full-fledged internal drama, one that required careful navigation to prevent exposure, panic, or misunderstanding. And then there were the rumors of private conversations with other royals. Prince Charles, Prince Harry, and other family members were reportedly briefed in stages, each encounter carefully orchestrated to manage emotional impact. Kate continued to serve as the anchor, ensuring that William remained composed while also addressing the growing concerns of family members and staff. The palace became a delicate choreography, balancing secrecy, medical advice, and emotional support, a dance that grew increasingly complex as the implications of William's worsening condition became clear. But as meticulous as the palace was in managing information, one critical piece of data slipped through, a detail so subtle yet significant that it threatened to upend the careful balance. It suggested a complication that could escalate the crisis beyond anything previously considered. The whispers in the corridors, the secret meetings, the careful monitoring. They were all preparing the palace for a revelation that no one outside could anticipate. What came next would shock even the most seasoned palace staff, surprise the family, and force a confrontation with a reality that could no longer be contained behind closed doors. The world saw Prince William smiling, greeting dignitaries with a calm hand, attending events with the same precision and poise that has defined him for decades. Cameras captured his confident posture, the flawless execution of ceremonial duties, and the carefully measured warmth that endeared him to the public. To millions, life went on as usual. To those closest to him, however, every appearance was a delicate mask, a layer of performance carefully constructed to hide the private struggle that was intensifying with every passing day. Public appearances have always been a double-edged sword for members of the royal family. On the one hand, they reinforce a narrative of stability, tradition, and continuity. On the other, they amplify scrutiny, leaving no room for vulnerability. For William, who was now grappling with a worsening medical condition, this tension became almost unbearable. Each handshake, each speech, each carefully staged photograph was simultaneously an act of duty and an exercise in concealment. Every movement, no matter how subtle, was a statement to the world: I am still capable. I am still strong. Yet the cracks were visible to those who knew how to look. Photographers, long familiar with the rhythms and expressions of the royal family, began noticing fleeting signs of strain. A brief pause before moving from one side of the room to another, a hand hovering uncertainly before shaking another's, a fleeting grimace that vanished as quickly as it appeared. For the casual observer, these moments were insignificant. For insiders, they were pieces of a larger, troubling puzzle. Each minor hesitation, each subtle gesture, was a signal that William's private struggle was intruding on the carefully orchestrated public persona. Kate's role became increasingly critical in this delicate balancing act. She was not only supporting her husband emotionally, but also acting as a stabilizing presence in public engagements. Staff observed her subtly guiding William through events, offering gentle cues, a reassuring hand on his back, a whispered suggestion to take a moment or pause. Her interventions were almost imperceptible to the cameras, yet crucial to maintaining the image of composure. Behind every public smile was a network of support quietly ensuring that the strain of private challenges did not spill into the public eye. The contrast between public appearance and private reality became even more pronounced during high-profile events. At a recent charity gala, William greeted hundreds of attendees with his trademark warmth and precision. Yet those standing closest to him noted a subtle tension in his posture, a brief hesitation before responding to questions, a flicker of fatigue in his eyes that no amount of polish could hide. These private moments, invisible to the media, were telling. They revealed the human cost of maintaining a public image while battling a private struggle that could no longer be ignored. Medical staff and aides worked tirelessly to prepare him for these appearances. Every engagement was meticulously planned to minimize physical strain while maximizing the perception of normalcy. Yet, even with careful planning, there were moments when the physical and emotional toll became unavoidable. A speech that would normally take 30 minutes could stretch into an ordeal, each word carefully measured, each gesture choreographed to maintain composure. Every photograph, every handshake, every smile required a calculated effort that drew on both discipline and courage. But it wasn't just physical strain that William was managing. The psychological pressure was immense. The need to project strength, to remain a symbol of continuity, created a mental burden that compounded the effects of his worsening condition. Insiders report moments of frustration and fleeting despair, rare glimpses behind the carefully constructed mask that the public never sees. These moments, though brief, were revealing. They highlighted the complexity of balancing duty with vulnerability, performance with reality, and public expectation with private necessity. Even within the family, the tension was palpable. Kate reportedly had to constantly gauge William's energy levels, his readiness for public interaction, and his capacity to maintain composure. She became a silent partner in the performance, anticipating challenges, adjusting pacing, and providing support in ways that were both practical and deeply empathetic. The dynamic extended beyond public appearances to private moments. Brief reassurances, whispered conversations, and strategic planning sessions to manage the inevitable tension that accompanied each engagement. The dichotomy between public perception and private struggle also extended to interactions with other royals. Prince Charles, Prince Harry, and other senior members of the family were acutely aware of the delicate balance William had to maintain. In private, discussions were candid and sometimes stark, exploring potential interventions, contingency plans, and strategies to protect both health and public image. In public, however, these conversations were invisible, leaving the world to assume a seamless, composed family navigating the responsibilities of royalty with grace and ease. Even aides and staff experienced this tension firsthand. One insider described the strain of maintaining appearances while managing private health concerns. You have to walk a fine line. Every action, every instruction is measured. You're aware of the public eye at all times, but you're also acutely aware that behind closed doors, this is very serious. It's like living in two parallel worlds, and you never know when the lines will blur. This duality, balancing public perception with private struggle, defined every day of William's life during this period. The public, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the severity of the situation. News outlets noted nothing amiss, social media captured polished moments, and fans continued to celebrate William's appearances with admiration and enthusiasm. Yet those closest to him knew the truth. The smile he wore was sometimes an act of endurance, the gestures sometimes an exercise in willpower, and the words sometimes spoken through a filter of controlled effort. The difference between perception and reality was stark, and it was growing with every passing day. Compounding the challenge were moments of unpredictability. No matter how carefully planned, public appearances carry variables, unexpected questions, sudden changes in schedule, or unanticipated interactions. Each of these moments could reveal vulnerability, strain, or fatigue, threatening to expose the reality that the palace worked so hard to conceal. William and Kate had to be prepared for these contingencies at every engagement, navigating the delicate interplay between performance, composure, and the hidden struggle that defined his daily experience. Observers also noted that the tension was not solely physical. The psychological and emotional strain was evident in fleeting moments, brief pauses during speeches, a quick intake of breath before responding to a question, subtle shifts in tone or expression. These signals, though minute, revealed the human cost of maintaining the carefully constructed public image while managing a private health crisis. Even the most disciplined individual cannot completely hide vulnerability, and the contrast between appearance and reality became increasingly pronounced. Aides and staff developed protocols to manage the inevitable fatigue and tension. Micro breaks during long events, strategic seating arrangements, and quiet support systems became integral to each public appearance. Every detail was scrutinized, every potential risk evaluated, and every contingency accounted for. Yet despite all the planning, moments of strain still emerged, fleeting, subtle, but telling. They were reminders that no amount of preparation could fully mask the reality of William's condition. The public's perception of perfection contrasted sharply with the private reality. A smile captured in a photograph could mask a wave of pain or exhaustion. A bow during a ceremony could conceal a fleeting moment of physical difficulty. And while the cameras captured only the polished exterior, those closest to William understood the profound human struggle behind every public appearance. It was a performance of resilience, endurance, and courage that few outside the palace could truly comprehend. And then came a moment that underscored the fragile balance between public duty and private struggle. During a recent engagement, a seemingly minor incident revealed the limits of endurance. A brief lapse in focus, a subtle hesitation in movement, and a fleeting grimace, all invisible to the public but instantly recognized by those closest to him, signaled that the strain of maintaining appearances was exacting a tangible toll. It was a reminder that even the strongest individuals have limits, and that public perception can mask profound private challenges. The dichotomy between public appearances and private struggles defined every day of William's life. It was a delicate dance, requiring precision, discipline, and support from those around him. Yet the worsening of his condition meant that the stakes were higher than ever. Every engagement, every handshake, every photograph carried the weight of both duty and vulnerability, a tension that threatened to unravel if not carefully managed. But just as the palace seemed to have adapted to this fragile balance, a new development emerged, one that threatened to shatter the careful choreography of public appearances and reveal the private struggles that had been so painstakingly hidden. What came next would leave the palace scrambling, the family deeply concerned, and insiders questioning how long appearances could continue to mask the reality. The news of Prince William's worsening condition did not exist in isolation. It rippled outward, reaching the ears of his closest family members, each of whom had their own emotional and practical responses. The royal family, often portrayed as a unified front to the public, is, in truth, a complex network of relationships, each member carrying their own perspectives, histories, and priorities. And as William confronted this escalating challenge, the reactions of those closest to him were as revealing as the symptoms themselves. Prince Charles, his father, felt a mix of concern, responsibility, and an unspoken urgency. To Charles, William's health was not only a personal worry but a matter of continuity for the monarchy. The timing could not have been worse. Charles, who has navigated decades of public scrutiny, understood better than anyone the stakes involved when an heir faces a serious health issue. Insiders reveal that he immediately intensified his involvement, scheduling private consultations with the doctors, requesting detailed reports, and even contacting trusted experts outside the immediate palace medical team. Every decision, every piece of information was carefully weighed. Kate, of course, remained the emotional anchor. She had already been managing the delicate balance between private care and public performance, but now the intensity increased exponentially. Sources report that she spent long nights reviewing medical advice, coordinating with staff, and supporting William through moments of visible strain. She became not only a partner, but a stabilizing force in a household suddenly charged with tension and uncertainty. Kate's empathy and meticulous attention to detail were invaluable, particularly as the rest of the family grappled with shock and concern. Meanwhile, Prince Harry, though physically distant, was pulled into the unfolding situation. Though his public life had diverged from the monarchy, his bond with William remained profound. Reports suggest that Harry received discreet updates from aides and staff, often in encrypted or confidential communications. The news reportedly hit him hard. Sources describe moments of private anguish, phone calls that lasted hours, and an intense desire to be present, even from afar. Despite any past disagreements, Harry's reaction underscored the enduring bond between brothers, a bond tested now not by rivalry, but by fear and concern.